A DJ doing a set that's 201 hours? You getting so paranoid that you become a recluse and stalking someone because you think they're stealing information from you. All of this on today's most amazing top 10 list. Coming in at number 10 with Peter Tripp DJing for 201 hours. Back in the 50s, radio host Peter Tripp wanted to do something that would test his body and put on a show for all the people around him. He set up a massive goldfish bowl in Times Square, and from here he would be DJing for 201 hours straight, or at least that was the plan. There wasn't going to be any breaks, no sleep, and this was going to be one of the strangest endurance tests imaginable. Before he was halfway into the challenge, he was already starting to slip. He started to have serious hallucinations and became very combative. He would scream at people walking by, and at one point he started taking off his clothes because he was convinced that spiders were crawling all over his body. Yeah, I think it's safe to say that we definitely need sleep, guys. Coming in number 9, we have the drug frenzy. A lot of times people can have their insomnia worsened by drug use. If the person is taking too many stimulants or taking the same stimulant too often, then that can have them stay up for days. A Reddit user wrote about their roommate who would suffer from insomnia, but they also like to use drugs that would keep them up all night. This ended up turning into a vicious cycle where the insomnia would keep them up all night, and then they would use drugs to get through the day at work and then come home and crash. One day, instead of coming home and crashing, they just did more drugs and stayed up until the following day and went to work. They ended up doing this for 3 days in a row until their whole world came tumbling down because they had a heart attack. I couldn't even imagine what was flowing through their head when this happened. Thankfully, this Reddit user said that their friend went to go get help after this happened. Coming in at number 8, we have hallucinate. One of the scariest things that can happen to you when you are sleep deprived is you will start to hallucinate. This can both be auditory and visual hallucinations, and this will start after only a few hours of sleep deprivation. So you should be trying to get to bed on time because you have no idea what kind of tricks your brain will try and play on you if you don't get enough sleep. And this isn't rare either. Somewhere around 80% of people who experience sleep deprivation will have some sort of hallucination happen to them. It's because your brain is literally too tired to filter out your imagination from real life. Some people will get what they call a waking dream. This can be a state of dreaming while you're still conscious. When people experience things like this, it can be hard to discern what was actually happening from what was just made up in their head, and this flows right into my next point. Coming in at number 7, we have false memories. People have such bad insomnia that they will sometimes not sleep for days at a time and can develop what doctors call a false memory. Now, because your brain is in a constant state of exhaustion, then it can be hard for it to properly store your memories, and this could be something small. It could be you remembering a song differently, or where you put your keys, or what happened on the TV show last night. But for someone who hasn't slept for days, they can start to make up memories and understand them as reality. This can be exacerbated by the fact that when people don't get enough sleep, they can start to become extremely paranoid. So they can start to make up whole backstories in their mind about what's going on around them. Sometimes this can cause people to get violent or even become suspicious of all the people close to them. Coming in at number 6, we have the recluse. We have another story about someone who goes by the username Mike48Turner. They wrote about how they used to have terrible insomnia, and it would be normal for them to get only 2 or 3 hours of sleep every night. Eventually, the problem worsened and they started to go a couple days without sleeping, and even when they did, it wasn't very refreshing. Eventually, they started to develop a serious case of paranoia, and they didn't trust any of the people around them. This made them come to the conclusion that the only way they could stay safe was by working from home. Eventually, they stopped going out altogether. He would only order food in, and he would get all of his supplies ordered to the house. Toothpaste, toilet paper. He had everything brought to his door, and he would even go through every last piece of it to make sure none of it was tampered with. This was so bad that he was looking under his fingernails because he thought someone had put a tracking device underneath them. Something changed and his body just shut down one day. He fell asleep for what was probably 2 days. And when he woke up, it was like someone turned a light on in his brain. That was the first time he could see clearly in months. After that, he went to get help and he started to take better care of himself to ensure that his sleep cycle wouldn't be disturbed again. Coming in at number 5, we have gambling it all away. A story online talked about a man who spent everything his family had at the casino while he was struggling from insomnia. This person needed a vacation and they thought what was best was to go to Vegas and try and get some rest and relaxation. But here's the thing, sometimes if you go to a new place, your problems will still follow you. This guy couldn't get a good night's sleep to save his life. Eventually it got so bad that he just started to go down to the casino to try and get his mind off of things. But people suffering from insomnia have a tendency not to care very much about money and start to be very irresponsible with it, and this guy threw away half of his life savings. Coming in at number 4, we have someone attacking their neighbor. Here's another case of someone losing it from having an extreme case of insomnia. This person was struggling with sleep, and like some of the other people on this list, they would go a day or two without sleeping. This caused their paranoia to creep up to uncontrollable levels, and most of this unhinged energy would get focused right into their neighbor, who would walk their dog around the same time every day. They started to think that their neighbor was spying on them and that they were planning something sinister. So one day they finally snapped. When their neighbor walked past their house, they ran out to confront them. They got into an argument with them, and this turned into a physical altercation. Well, it turns out that this sleep-deprived person's neighbor was actually a skilled martial artist, and they were able to subdue them until the police arrived. After a thorough inspection, it was discovered that this person needed psychiatric help, and they were administered to a psychiatric hospital for evaluation. Coming in at number 3, we have stuck in bed. Here's another story I pulled from the interweb. It's about a college student who was suffering from a pretty extreme case of insomnia. It started as them being someone who just loved being out during the night, but then it morphed into someone who couldn't sleep at all at night and eventually couldn't sleep for days at a time. Something that can happen to people suffering from insomnia is they will get a very intense case of depression. Your body starts to shut down because you can't get enough sleep to function. This person was now too depressed to get out of bed, but they were battling such a bad case of insomnia that they couldn't sleep. Their bed became a prison. It was taunting them to fall asleep. Just fall asleep and you'll be free from this bed. But they couldn't do it no matter how hard they tried. They would get little bursts of sleep here and there, but only a few hours at a time. Eventually, their family came to visit them and saw what kind of state they were in. Through the help of their family and reducing stress by dropping out of school, they were able to fix their health and get their life back on track. Coming in at number 2, we have downing sleeping pills. From the start, this sounds like a very scary one, but it really wasn't a person trying to harm themselves. This story was thrown on Reddit as a lesson of what not to do if you're struggling with insomnia. This person was having a really rough go. They had to work 2 jobs just to pay rent, and this led to them having a horrible sleep cycle. Eventually, they just stopped sleeping. They would get a few hours of sleep here and there, but nothing was consistent, and they started to feel horrible all the time. This led to them getting sick frequently, which led to them taking medication so they could keep working, but they still never had time to rest properly, and even if they did, their insomnia was too harsh to let them fall asleep. Eventually, they had enough of this vicious cycle and they booked a week off work so they could have some time to reset. But when they were free to do nothing, they still couldn't fall asleep because of their insomnia. This led to them downing a bunch of sleeping pills to fall asleep, and the results were nearly deadly. The roommate found them almost dead, and they called an ambulance. The Redditor ended up being in a coma for 3 days, and after this they quit both their jobs and changed their life so they didn't have to go through something that horrible again. And coming in at the number 1 spot, we have stalking someone. Another story thrown on Reddit, this time by someone who deleted their account, and it follows a very strange story of obsession. This person wrote that they started to lose their mind from lack of sleep. They were convinced that one of the baristas that worked at the coffee shop across the street from them was monitoring them and selling their information. This was a psychosis brought on by several nights without sleep. This got so bad that ironically they started to monitor the barista and found out what their work schedule was. They would set up a camera that faced out their window so they could watch the person, and they even would go into the coffee shop and sit there for hours at a time so they could watch this person. Eventually they started to follow them when they got off work. This led to our Redditor having a mental breakdown in their own apartment and admitting themselves to a hospital. Eventually they got help and all these strange thoughts disappeared. Alright guys, that has been our list. I've been your host Jade Arena, and remember, get a good night's sleep. Celebrities going through a drug psychosis, people barricading themselves in their own homes, and hallucinations that will drive you mad. We have all of this on today's most amazing top 10 list. Coming in at number 10, we have Fergie hiding from everyone. I love Fergie, and I'm convinced that Duchess is one one of the best albums of all time. You can at me, I don't care. But something that I didn't know about her until recently was that she actually used to struggle with a drug addiction. The drug that she would take would cause her to hallucinate and have extremely bad paranoia. She started thinking that the FBI and CIA were after her, so she blacked out her windows in her home. She didn't want anyone looking through her windows, and she hated when anyone would come close to her home. I mean, that would make your house feel like a prison. This actually caused her to stop eating. Her hallucinations and paranoia would cause her to think that people were tampering with her food, and if someone offered her something to eat, she would think that they were in on it, as in they were a spy that was sent by the CIA. She got down to 90 pounds, but thankfully she was able to get better and kick her addiction. Coming at number 9, we have Thinking You Died. A Reddit user talked about how they did so many mushrooms that they were convinced they died. They just laid on the couch and looked up at the ceiling, and they thought that they were dead and trapped in their body. They were having thoughts that they couldn't move, and they thought that they were for real experiencing death. They talked about it and they said at first they were more scared than they had ever been before in their life. They spent what felt like hours panicking because they realized they were going to be stuck like this until the end of time, and that is horrifying. But then they felt this calm come over their body and tell them that they needed to come to peace with this, which is actually kind of beautiful. Eventually they came back to reality and they said it was the wildest experience they ever had on drugs. Next on the list we have Gave Themselves Heat Exhaustion. Redditor Desiree X3 talked about his brother who had horrible schizophrenia and would think that the whole family was attacking him all the time. He would freak out constantly and run away from his home. At first they didn't know what was happening and they would try to help him out, but he would fight off everyone. One time he had an especially bad episode and ran out of the house in blazing heat. Only a Reddit user and their brother were home at the time, and our Reddit user wasn't old enough to drive, so he tried to chase his brother down, but he was too fast and he got away. They had to look for him for hours. When they found him, they took him to the hospital and he had terrible heat exhaustion. Now their brother is heavily medicated and doesn't have any of these problems that he used to have. Number 7 on the list we have Screaming at Strangers. Reddit user Engineer1882 said they used to work as a paramedic and they would have to help people with schizophrenia and horrible hallucinations quite often. It was a very scary thing to deal with, but he had one patient that he had a very interesting encounter with. This person was walking along the sidewalk and screaming at people walking down the street. This person thought that demons were coming out of the ground and trying to attack the people around them. This person was frightened, obviously, and they were very angry and potentially dangerous. But as soon as our paramedic Reddit user arrived on the scene, this person calmed down. They were still hallucinating, but seeing the paramedics made things more clear. They asked him what was wrong and he told them that he was having hallucinations and then described them in detail. He told them that this was common for him when he ran out of medication. Next on the list we have Ran Away. There are going to be a lot of points on this list that are just going to be warnings. Like, I can't control what you do, but if you're going to try anything that shifts your mental state, be careful. Like, this next point just involves cannabis, something that a lot of people use and love to use and has a ton of health benefits, but too much of a good thing can make you lose your mind. This involves edibles. Now, when consuming edibles, it can be hard to figure out what your right dosage is, especially if they are homemade. This story follows a Reddit user that made a tray of brownies that had cannabis in them. They had never made edibles before and they ate half the tray. Oh my god, just saying that gives me anxiety. Well, they started to get a little too high, then more high, and then they didn't stop getting high. They got so high that they started to have auditory hallucinations. They thought they could hear people walking in their house. They convinced themselves that someone was in their home and was trying to kill them, so they ran out of their house barefoot in the winter. They had no idea how long they ran for, but thank God someone found them and was able to relax them. But they did do lasting damage to their feet and needed to have one of their toes removed because of frostbite. So guys, get your dosages right. Next on the list we have Hid from Voices. Reddit user Desolite talked about their own battle with their mental health. They said that they would hear voices all the time when they were home alone. They would hear people calling their names from other rooms. That would freak me out so bad because even if you knew this was all in your head, it would be constantly picking at you until you got up to go look in the other room to check, because you would never know if the voices are real or not. They would also see people standing in windows staring back at them. That sounds like one of the worst things to me, because that's something that could actually happen. You could have a creep looking at the window through you, just watching you. So if you had hallucinations of this kind of thing, then you would never know when you were safe and when you weren't. I'm so happy that I personally don't have to deal with anything like this, and my heart goes out to anyone who struggles with this. Next on the list, we have lost contact with reality. I pulled this one from A Very Well Mind, and it's a story from Jack. He took way too much acid. This is not a drug to mess around with if you don't know what you're doing, because it is strong. Jack said he took 125 milligrams of acid, and from that he blasted off to another world. He said that this was the first time he did the drug and he lost connection with reality, and this trip would be so horrible that he would never do acid again. He got transported to another world where all the people around him were massive insects that had humanoid faces. He said that this was a dark, horrifying place, and he ran to hide from everyone around him. He didn't want them to come near him, and it took him hours to come down and return to reality. He was so scared, which makes perfect sense. I would probably never leave my room if something like that happened to me. Imagine if you have a fear of bugs and you see something like that, you would get PTSD from that experience and never be able to look at people or bugs again. Next on the list, we have stayed up for days. Here's something that they don't tell you about psychedelic drugs. When you're high on them, it's nearly impossible to fall asleep. A Reddit user talked about a time they were at a music festival, which can just be a large grassy area where people do a bunch of illegal substances. But they were partying, and who can blame them? They took more acid and mushrooms than they had ever taken before, and it started off great. They were having so much fun. But after 10 hours of tripping super hard, they were emotionally and physically drained. They wanted to go to sleep, but they couldn't. They were too high. They laid down in their tent and just stared at the ceiling, watching it shift and change. 8 hours later, they were still awake and possibly even more high than they were before. At this point, their hallucinations started to increase from sleep deprivation, and because they were so exhausted, their hallucinations started to get dark. The ground started to look like dead bodies that were all linked together. On the bright side, they weren't so high that they thought that this was their reality. Eventually, they went to the medical tent and then the hospital, but it was 3 days before they could fall asleep. Next on the list, we have jumped out a window. This is a story of someone who thought it'd be cool to mix one too many drugs. Here's the thing about hallucinogenic drugs. Many of them have amazing benefits. Some people have been using psilocybin mushrooms to help people with PTSD. There's a lot of research that shows ayahuasca can heal the brain. But when you try to mess around with these things and you don't respect them, they will kick your ass. This story is following a young woman who thought she could take multiple hits of acid and over 6 grams of psilocybin mushrooms. This caused her to have very intense hallucinations, and she had no idea where she was. She climbed out of a second-story window and fell right on her face. She survived, but she shattered many of the bones in her face, and she needed reconstructive surgery. Luckily, she didn't have any lasting brain damage, but she did get a concussion. She also needed to learn how to use her face again because it was out of use for so long. That is a very scary situation that none of us would want to be in. And coming into the #1 spot, we have ate someone's face. I don't know if you guys remember the horrors of bath salts, but they were all over the news a little while ago. People were talking about it a ton, and it was all because of this story. A man named Rudy Eugene ate a man's face after taking bath salts. Let's backtrack a little bit. It was the year 2012, and there was a huge drug called bath salts that was flying through the US. It was kind of like meth, but it would make you hallucinate super hard, and more than one person turned to cannibalism. Rudy Eugene took this drug and then attacked a homeless man and started to eat his face. Someone saw this and obviously called the police. When the police arrived, they were able to save the homeless man, but they had to shoot Rudy Eugene, who didn't survive. So the moral of the story is don't do bath salts. That sounds like one of the scariest things that you could put in your body. I don't care how much coffee you drink, there isn't enough caffeine to turn you into a cannibal. You might just get a little anxiety. Alright guys, that has been your list. I've been your host Chad Arena, and remember, don't eat people's faces. What's this? Dark things people did due to hallucinations? They say sorry, that's funny. They talked about it and they said at first they were mostly they talked about it and they said at first they had been more scared than they coming in at number, I don't know, thinking people are stalking you, never eating again, and causing your heart to stop working. I'm your host Jay Duran, and we have all of this on today's most amazing top 10 list. Coming in number 10, we have combing the history. One of the worst parts of not being able to sleep is that it will increase your paranoia to levels that you didn't know were possible. Like, you know that feeling you get when you think that people are laughing at you when you hear a group of people laugh? Well, what if you had that feeling all the time? Someone who goes by the Reddit handle Belinda12 wrote about a struggle they had with insomnia that made them think that everyone was out to get them all the time, and they had to hide from everyone. They said that insomnia was something that they always struggled with and took medication for, but even when they were medicated, they still had trouble staying asleep, and the little bit of sleep they would get would never feel like it gave them any sort of rest. They started to get this weird feeling that someone was stalking them through social media. Every time they got a friend request that they didn't recognize or someone liked their picture that they didn't know, they would start to feel anxious. Belinda12 eventually started to stay up all night so they could comb through all their history to see who had been looking at their social media. They wanted to find out who this person was. They would stay up late every night looking through every profile, everyone who ever interacted with them on social media. They would only get a couple of hours sleep every other night and then head off to work. The people they worked with could see that their health was getting worse, and eventually someone reached out to find out what was going on. This person helped Belinda12 seek professional help, and they wrote if it wasn't for this coworker, they think they might have gone insane. Next on the list, we have vanishing. The person who wrote this next post never suffered from insomnia, but had a friend who would struggle with it constantly. They always talked about how they could never get enough sleep, and they always looked haggard. Eventually, they noticed that their friends stopped coming out as much, which made sense, they were always tired. But something else started happening. This person was slowly deleting all of their social media. They would delete photos at first, remove some friends, unfollow some people, and then eventually just started deleting entire pages. Now, this isn't crazy, it's a pretty normal thing for people to get fed up with social media and close everything down. It's not like social media is the be-all end-all, but now there was only one way for this person to reach out to their friend, and one day they just stopped answering their phone. So our writer went to find their friend. They came to their house and no one was there. They looked around the house and all the windows were covered with newspaper. Eventually they found a way to sneak in and there was nothing in the house. Like, they just got up and moved without telling anyone, and they never saw their friend again. And guys, make sure you hit that like button because it really helps us out. Next on the list, we have messing with their fertility. This is something very scary and true. If you get too sleep deprived, it can stop you from having kids because it messes around with your fertility. I read a report online about a woman who was struggling to have children for almost 2 years. She had 2 miscarriages and she was about to give up on having children. But she went to a health specialist who helped her with her sleep cycle, and she was able to fix her issues with her fertility and have children. Next on the list, we have sickness. One thing we don't think about is how good sleep is for your body. Some people will just brush off sleep because they're on the grind all the time, and they will reject something that is super important for their health. If you mess around with your sleep too much, it can increase your chances of Alzheimer's, diabetes, cancer, and a ton of other diseases. So it should be no surprise that someone on Reddit wrote about the struggle they had with their health because of insomnia. They said it had started with them just catching a cold every now and again. It would be normal for them to get sick about once a month, but they had a very taxing job and they needed to stay up late into the night to get everything done. This was their life and there wasn't much they could do about it. Eventually this got worse. They had constant headaches. Every other day their head would start pounding, but they didn't want to stop and rest. They kept pushing through their lack of sleep and increasing sickness and just started medicating the problem. This turned into ulcers and they had such intense stomach pains that they eventually had to leave work. The time off allowed them to rest and so many of their health problems went away. After this, they switched jobs and moved on to something that wouldn't threaten their health. Their doctor told them if they had pushed much further, they might have given themselves something serious like Crohn's disease. Next on the list, we have creating an imaginary friend. This story is wild. I snagged this one off of a health forum, and it was someone who talked about how their insomnia got so bad that they had a fit where they stayed up for 3 days. During this time, they started to have waking dreams. This is where your dream reality will meld with the real world. This will cause people to lose touch with reality around them. They created an imaginary friend that they thought was a real person. This creation would tell them what to do and was feeding their paranoia. It kept telling them that they shouldn't go to sleep or someone was going to to come for them in their sleep. It told them the police were outside waiting to take them to an insane asylum and they couldn't leave their house. They thought that the parked cars right outside their house were all CIA and FBI. The reason that they were having a fit of insomnia was because they'd been taking massive doses of Adderall, and this made it so they couldn't fall asleep. Eventually they ran out of the drug, and because they were too paranoid to go outside, they never went to go get more, and they passed out. When they woke up, they felt as if they had just woken up from the most insane dream, but they realized that that all happened in real life. This person took this as a sign to start going to rehab. Next on the list we have starving yourself. This is actually something very common with people who suffer from insomnia. They lose the urge to eat because the body isn't functioning properly. If it gets really bad, you can start to get paranoid to the point where you think that people have been tampering with your food, and this can also be a reason that people will stop eating. I couldn't imagine how scary that would be. For one, I love food, so I wouldn't want anything to come into my life that would stop me from eating and enjoying food. On top of that, how would it feel if you were forcing yourself to eat because you know you're supposed to, but it literally makes you feel sick because you think there's something disgusting inside it? Even though your logical mind is telling you there's nothing wrong with your food, your paranoid mind is telling you the exact opposite. It sounds like a hell that I never want to experience. Right after that we have overeating. Now, rolling off our last point, you can actually have the exact opposite thing happen to you because you're so sleep deprived that you constantly feel the need to eat. There is an area of your brain known as the basal ganglia, or also called the lizard brain. This is the oldest part of the brain, and it is responsible for the most primal parts of your mind. Our fight or flight mechanism comes from this part of the brain. Many emotional connections are triggered in this part of the brain, and it can affect your appetite in a big way. When you are sleep deprived, you can have the urge to eat more unhealthy foods, things that are high in sugars, fats, and carbs. Your brain is telling you to eat more of these foods because your body is looking for instant energy because your mind is so tired. So when you're battling insomnia, you can start to see massive weight gain from the lack of sleep and your brain telling you to eat unhealthy food. When people are in a constant battle with insomnia, they can start to feel like they need to eat these unhealthy foods and will start overeating. On top of that, these unhealthy foods will attribute to the person's insomnia and it can become a vicious cycle. Next on the list we have self-harm. One story I read online talked about how a person got such bad insomnia that they started to have horrible hallucinations that something was under their skin. Having the feeling of bugs crawling under your skin or all over your body is a common symptom of someone who is severely sleep deprived. This person said that they started to feel bugs everywhere, but for a while they were able to fight it off and realize that it was only in their mind. But as things got worse, eventually they started scratching their own skin to get to the bugs that they thought were underneath. They couldn't help it. Luckily, they were able to snap out of it and get help before they did any serious damage to their body. After that, guys, we have running away from your family. We have come to this conclusion time and time again. If you get bad insomnia, it can lead to extreme cases of paranoia. In this case, we have a father who was working 3 jobs and trying to provide for his family. There was an insane amount of stress on his shoulders, and this led to him having insomnia and eventually a breakdown. The guy ran away from his whole family and never came back. They never got word of where he went, and he just abandoned his kids and his wife. And finally, guys, we have gave himself a heart attack. Here's something that I shouldn't have to say by now. We're at the end of part 2 of this series, but you need sleep. Unfortunately for people with insomnia, they know this, but they still can't sleep. They are staying up because they just can't fall asleep no matter what they do. And for Reddit user Roscoe Nighthat, they probably had the worst outcome possible. They were working as a bartender at a club that would open up at 9 and stay open till 6 a.m. And then some days they would go straight from their bar job right over to a second gig where they had to translate court documents. Not something you should be doing on no sleep. Well, this was hard to do, and anyone in the restaurant industry will tell you that it's easy to get into drugs, so that's what Roscoe did. They started taking drugs so they could stay up, and this led to some major health issues. Every now and again, they would get chest pains, but they would just push it off and keep moving forward. Well, people should listen to their bodies because eventually this person had a heart attack. They made it through it, but they were only 35 when this happened, and this was a very eye-opening experience for them. Alright guys, that has been our list. I've been your host Chad Arena, and we'll see you guys on the next one. Bye. There is an area of your brain known as the basal ganglia. One story I read online talked about how a person got such a bad the people they worked with could see that their health was deteriorating. deteriorating. Psychosis can come in many different forms. Some people can be extremely dangerous, but sometimes it can just be someone struggling to deal with their own thoughts because they get out of control. We have all of this on today's most amazing top 10 list. Coming in at number 10, we have BELLE GUNNESS. It should be no surprise that a lot of serial killers have suffered from some sort of psychosis. Now with BELLE GUNNESS, the year was 1909, so there wasn't the same medical services available to give someone the diagnosis of psychosis, but just listen to what this lady did and I'll let you be the judge of the matter. BELLE GUNNESS moved to the United States from Norway, and it would seem that she wanted to start a new life with her family. Well, they would have a much worse time than her. The family ran a candy shop, and a few years into running it, the shop would burn down, 2 of her children would die, and her husband would also die. She would be fine and make a ton of money off of all of this when the business and life insurance claims came in. So now she was sitting on a pretty big chunk of change, but if you're in the game of killing people for money, you gotta keep the cash flow up. She married again, and then that guy died out of nowhere from what seemed to be blunt force trauma. She then put an ad in the newspaper saying she was looking for a husband. Back then that was a very viable way to find a mate. Well, dude after dude started showing up at her place, and one after the other they kept going missing. Very strange. Eventually this lady was investigated, and there were over a dozen bodies found on her property. She never gave the official number of how many people she killed. Coming in at number 9, we have lost everything. A Reddit user talked about the struggle they had with their mental health before they were able to get help. They were working as a grocery store clerk, and they started to develop a feeling that the people at the store were stealing from them. They had a voice in their head that kept telling them that everyone around them was a thief. They would try to push the voice out, but it kept getting louder. Eventually they snapped on the people they work with and they got fired. After this, they found it impossible to get a job anywhere because they were suspicious of everyone around them. This voice in their head was constantly talking to them. They would try and block it out, but they just couldn't, so they couldn't pay their rent, and eventually they ended up on the streets. For 2 years they were stuck without a place to go until they were able to get help through a shelter. Once they were able to get properly medicated, it was like night and day. The voices stopped and they were able to start living a normal life again and get re-employed. At number 8, we have became extremely cruel. A story on Reddit talked about someone who had a serious case of psychosis, and it basically made them lose their empathy towards everyone. They were cruel to everyone to the point where they lost contact with all their friends and family. What had happened was they were hearing voices that would tell them that everyone was talking behind their back. Eventually they were so isolated that it only made things worse, but they eventually had a breakthrough when they thought that maybe they were the issue. So they went to go get help and they were able to clear up their issues. Coming in at number 7, we have heard voices. PBS interviewed a kid from San Francisco named Andrew. It was extremely interesting because he was able to give an in-depth account of what it was like for him to develop and deal with his own psychosis. He talked about how he would hear voices and messages through song lyrics, and he thought they were being sent directly to him.
The song lyrics would change, and they would say hateful things, racist things, homophobic things. They would tell me to harm people, they would talk about harming people.
He later goes on to talk about how he was very afraid to talk about these thoughts and what he was hearing in his head with other people because he thought that they would say he was making it up. Eventually he got on medication, and his mother said things got a lot better for him. The psychosis in the first place was a very harsh shift for Andrew. He was a happy-go-lucky kid before this, and this changed his life. He was all of a sudden quiet and afraid. He tried to get off his medication at one point, but this led to him having a psychotic break, and eventually he was put back on medication. You can see in the interview that you would never be able to tell that he was someone who was challenged with psychosis. Coming in at number 6, we have not sleeping for days. A Reddit user talked about how their psychosis would keep them up all night. They would literally hear voices screaming in their head that would stop them from sleeping. This was so frightening, and sometimes they would think someone was in their home. They would do what they could to try and block out the voices, but eventually they got louder and louder. Eventually it was to the point where they couldn't sleep. This only made things worse because sleep deprivation can induce psychosis. Eventually they started to hallucinate and were seeing shadowy figures move all around their apartment. This went on for days. Eventually they got so exhausted that they passed out and slept a full 24 hours. When they woke up, the voices were still there but much quieter, and they immediately went to go get help. Once on medication, they said their life improved tremendously. Something that is very important to note about the story is that the person writing it said they waited so long to get help because they were worried about getting locked up in a mental institution, but once they got help, they realized that this was the best thing they could have done for themselves. Coming in at number 5, we have Went on a Mission. Mike Hedrick, who is a blogger and author, talked about his struggle with psychosis. He started to hear messages from the TV and thought that he was chosen to save the world. He started a dialogue in his head that he was destined to save the world and that he had to go out on a mission.
I flew out to New York, planning to go to the UN.
The entire interview is very interesting because it goes into detail about how his psychosis would make him justify his thoughts even though they would seem very outlandish. He ended up going to New York to try and talk before the UN, but he got there on a Saturday and just started walking around New York because the UN was closed. Eventually he wanted to leave and escape to Canada, and he got picked up by someone while hitchhiking. This person took him in and eventually bought him a train ticket to go home. When he got home to his family, they had no idea where he had been, and he told them all about his mission. They took him right to the hospital and he was able to reconnect with reality. Coming in at number 4, we have Starving Themselves. A Reddit user talked about how their psychosis made them afraid to eat. They kept getting the thought that their food was tampered with. They thought everything that they had bought had been contaminated in some way. Eventually they started growing their own food because that was the only way they could trust it, but that led to them thinking that the soil had been tampered with. They started wasting away more and more until they were so underweight that a family member made them go get help. After some medication, they returned to normal and no longer had a fear towards food. Coming in at number 3, we have Built a Murder House. The world is a scary place and we're just living in it. H.H. Holmes is one of the most terrifying people in history. This dude was a con artist turned serial killer. Back in 1985, he built what he would later call his murder castle. Picture this, a massive hotel that seems to be normal, but it's really designed to kill people and dispose of their bodies. This dude had rooms that had pipes that led to them, so he could fill the rooms with poison gas. He had secret entrances to those rooms so he could sneak in at night and kill people. He had trap doors in those rooms that would lead to a greased chute so he could slide their bodies into the basement and start hacking them up for his own sick pleasures. And if you were slick enough to get away from his traps, then there were hallways that led to nowhere and fake doors that couldn't be opened. It sounded like a horror movie, but this was all real. How he was able to build this was through hiring a contractor, and before they did enough work to catch on to what he was doing, he would fire them and then hire another guy. This guy was clearly psychotic. Coming in at number 2, we have Thinking You Have to Kill John Travolta. Back in the 1970s, cocaine was hot on the streets and people were consuming it like crazy without any idea of how bad it would be for your mind and body. There is something called cocaine psychosis, and that's what people can get from doing way too much of the drug. They will stay up all the time and become extremely paranoid. And this is what happened to Freddie Prinze Jr. He was one of the biggest stars of all time, one of the best stand-up comics of his time, and the star of the hit show Chico and the Man. For a moment he was the biggest guy in town, but Hollywood is fickle, and eventually there was a new young stud that came in, and that was John Travolta. He started to take Freddie's spot as the top dog in town, and because of Freddie's excessive drug use, he started to get into a paranoid state and thought that he had to kill John Travolta for stealing from him. He thought that he was stealing his fame, so he came up with a plan to kill the guy. He went and bought a crossbow, he went to John Travolta's hotel room, and he knocked on the door. When the dude didn't answer the door, he fired 3 bolts right into the door. Obviously, Freddie Prinze Jr. was never successful in his plan, and sadly, due to his deteriorating mental state, he ended up taking his own life. And coming in at the number 1 spot, we have Abusing Their Practice. Sometimes people who can seem normal can be the most psychotic. Harold Shipman, also known as Dr. Death, is one of the most notorious serial killers in modern history. He had a medical practice that allowed him to get close and personal with a lot of elderly people. Because of this, his murders went unnoticed for years, but after everything caught up with him and people started to investigate his practice, it's assumed that he killed over 200 people. He would inject them with a very high dose of diamorphine, and then these people would be cremated so there would be no body to do an autopsy on. Eventually, an undertaker and an owner of a crematorium noticed that there was an excessive amount of cremation certificates that had been signed off by Harold Shipman compared to other doctors. Also, many of the people who he was in care of would die sitting up. Usually when people are so sick they're about to die, they die laying down in bed. He was sentenced in the year 2000 to life without parole. Alright guys, I've been your host Chaderena, that has been our list, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now when Belle Gunness, He later goes on to talk about how he was eventually an undertaker and owner of a crematorium that had been signed off Bye. Stuck in sleep paralysis, tearing apart your own home, and spending your entire life looking up conspiracy theories. I'm your host, Chade Arena. We have all of this on today's most amazing top 10 list. Coming in at number 10, we have locked in sleep. We have covered sleep paralysis many times on this channel, so most of you at home will know about the horrors of this ailment. But for those of you who don't know, this is when you fall asleep but you're kind of half awake and you can't move, and then you start to have these waking dreams when some horrible creature will appear and torment you and you can't move the entire time, like I just said. It sounds like hell on earth, but did you know that this can cause insomnia? There are several reports of people developing insomnia because they have such horrendous sleep paralysis. When you think about it, it makes perfect sense. If every time you fall asleep you see monsters, then why would you ever want to sleep again? Personally, I like to avoid contact with any monsters or demons at any point. Coming in at number 9, we have prolonged sleep paralysis. We are rolling off the last point. If you start staying up for extended periods of time, developing some harsh insomnia to deal with your sleep paralysis, then eventually you are going to break and you will need to fall asleep. The body will win eventually and you're going to be sound asleep, or you're just going to be stuck in a waking dream and see demons for way longer than you should. Yeah, that can happen. A Reddit user told a story of how they would fight off sleep because they would constantly be visited by a creature they called the Spire. It had a long pin head and what seemed to be an opening at the center of it that was glowing dark red. They hated seeing the Spire, and they once went 48 hours without sleeping and then crashed super hard. When they finally passed out, they were asleep for 18 hours, and it felt like most of that sleep was accompanied by the Spire. It's hard to tell how long you're in sleep paralysis for because they're very similar to dreams in a way. But this guy said that his sleep paralysis was so long that he thought it would never end, and the Spire was speaking to him and was touching him for extended periods of time. Thank God I have zero problems with sleeping. Coming in at number 8, we have seeing messages. We have talked about waking dreams in previous parts of this series, but just in case you haven't seen the first two and just jumped into number 3, then let me break it down for you. When you get such bad insomnia that you can't sleep, you might start to enter a dream state while you are awake, and you can have trouble discerning what was dream and what was real life. This story was pulled from Dusty MC456, who said once while they were sleep deprived, they were writing down on a piece of paper and they started to see words appear. Words that they didn't remember writing down. The words started to move around on the page and it seems like someone was trying to send them a message. They tried to comprehend what was happening, but the words were too hard to read because they kept bouncing all over the place. Eventually they snapped out of it, and when they looked back at the paper, there was nothing there. This is where this ended, but I imagine if it continued, they would have thought they were being transmitted information from a secret individual. Coming in at number 7, we have hallucinations. Reddit user Former Window talked about hallucinations they would get from insomnia. They wrote that they would have both visuals and auditory hallucinations, and after reading the post, I'm not sure which one was scarier. They said it would be common for them to see shadowy figures in the corner of their eye, like a tall person shuffling around or an animal scurrying across the floor. They would quickly turn their head and see nothing there. They also said they would hear singing, like little kids singing, and it would get louder and louder, like the person was closing in. Honestly, the singing kids would scare the hell out of me. That sounds like what happens when Freddy Krueger's closing in. Coming in at number 6, we have answering imaginary questions. Reddit user ColorMePKeen talked about how after they had a baby, they were so stressed out about something going wrong that they couldn't fall asleep. It didn't help that the baby would wake them up in the middle of the night, so any chance they would have of falling asleep would be disturbed anyway. Well, this got so bad that they didn't sleep for 3 days, and they started to answer questions out loud that they were hearing in their own head. Coming in at number 5, we have ripped their house apart. A story pulled from Reddit follows a man's descent into paranoia from insomnia. He could never sleep and started to think that his house was bugged. This paranoia fed into his insomnia, and things compounded until he was only able to sleep for a couple hours every night. Eventually, he couldn't take it anymore and started to go through every inch of his house to try and find some sort of monitoring device. And this wasn't just looking under the table or behind the TV. This was a full demolition job. They started to rip up the floorboards, they were ripping out the drywall, they were going through the electrical, pulling out plumbing, taking apart electronics, cutting open the furniture, and this person even started to dig up their backyard because they thought they could find some sort of secret wiring that was leading to their home. One of the wildest parts about this whole thing was that this person didn't even have any sort of experience in home wiring, plumbing, or any of those things. It was a miracle that they didn't accidentally electrocute themselves. Well, in the end they found nothing, but they were still in a harsh state of paranoia. They had nowhere to turn and just sat in their destroyed home. It wasn't until their sister came to visit and saw them in this state that they were able to get help. Coming in at number 4, we have lived in their car. As you can probably tell by now, insomnia can lead to pretty extreme sleep deprivation, which can lead to paranoia, which can lead to hallucinations that you will start to believe. Another case of horrible insomnia follows someone who was too afraid to sleep because they were convinced that there was a demon in their home. They thought that if they fell asleep for too long, the demon would take control of their soul. Imagine being possessed in your sleep and then you wake up on a Monday and you gotta go to work. What a horrible way to start your week. Well, eventually that lack of sleep fed into their fear of demonic possession, and there was only one thing left to do, and that was live in your car. This person packed what they could fit into their car and then drove off. They lived in their car for 6 months while they tried to find a new place to live that was demon free. Of course, living in your car isn't great for your sleep, so the insomnia persisted until they actually had a fresh bed to sleep in. But who knows, maybe this one was justified and there was a demon in their home. Next on the list we have the commanding voice. Reddit user FRIENDZ talked about how their insomnia got so bad they started to hear a voice in their head. It would come and go, but the longer they didn't sleep, the louder and clearer the voice became. During an exceptionally bad bout with insomnia, they stayed up for 4 days. Man, I really have no idea what that would be like. Once it hits 12:30, I'm ready to tuck in and pass out. I don't care if the party is just starting. Well, a Reddit user was now hearing the voice in their head, and it was so loud they had no choice but to listen. The voice told them to look in the mirror, which they did, and while staring at themselves in the mirror, the voice told them to start pulling out their hair. The voice said that if they did this, they would finally be able to fall asleep. So they gave in and started pulling out their hair. Now, they didn't pull it out to the point where they went bald, but they did make their head a little bit patchy, and of course, this didn't help them fall asleep. Coming in at number 2, we have got obsessed with conspiracy theories. This one was posted to Reddit by Reddit user Riz34Zill. They said that they always been a skeptical person and were constantly looking up conspiracy theories. I think a lot of us out there are guilty of delving a little too deep into conspiracy theories, but this Reddit user said it became an obsession, and this is where their insomnia started. They would get home from work and then go right to the computer and start looking up YouTube videos about certain conspiracy theories. They would stay up all night watching video after video about flat earth, about the Illuminati, Area 51. It didn't matter how far the topic was. Eventually, it got so bad they couldn't fall asleep. They would feel anxious if they didn't go do their nightly research. If they didn't spend hours every night digging up some of the most bizarre corners of the internet, they would feel as if they were falling behind and that the powers that be were getting a leg up on them. This newfound insomnia was now feeding into this nightly routine, and right when it seemed like it was going to be his life forever, he snapped out of it. He watched a series of videos that just seemed too extreme, and he started to question all the things he'd been looking up. He took a step back and realized that he needed to stop, and he felt his anxiety melt away, and he was able to get back to a regular sleep routine. And coming in at the number 1 spot, we have camped out in the woods. This is another case of someone worried that they were being watched. I pulled this one off of a mental health help forum, and this person talked about how they struggled with paranoia their whole life. They took medication to deal with their constant fear that they were being monitored. Eventually, they started to feel better, so they went off their medication, and this is where the downward spiral started. It started with them not wanting to be around screens, so they got rid of their phone and their laptop. They were afraid of cameras, so they refused to go to any store that had a CCTV system. After this, they started to think that there could be someone or some sort of robotic device in their home that was watching them all the time. Now they couldn't sleep, and this insomnia only made the problem worse. They decided to fill a backpack full of goods and run off into the woods. They spent 2 weeks living out in the woods before someone found them. A hiker was coming through and saw this makeshift campsite and decided to talk to him for a little bit. After speaking to him, he realized that he was not well, and the hiker helped him get back to the city and visit a mental health center to get his medication and his life back on track. Alright guys, that has been our list. Thank you so much for tuning in. I've been your host, Shade Reina. We'll see you next time. This is where they ended the story, but I imagine which can lead to hallucinations, which can lead to once it hits 12:30, I'm ready to